Welcome back! Today we discuss what happens when a baby girl is considered by a whole society to be a symbol for evil. Let's analyze the character of Pearl in the Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter opens with a scene of a prison and then a woman being led onto a scaffold to be mocked for her adultery. And in her arms is this baby girl, the product of her adultery. And therefore, from then on throughout the book, the woman is marked as an adulteress, yes, but so is the child. The child is set apart as the product of sin. And in some ways, the child becomes another symbol for the adultery that her parents had. How does such a situation develop that child's character? Well, it's very complicated in the book. In the first several chapters, we only see the child as a small infant being held by her mother, but she does seem to react to her mother's emotional state. When they arrive in the prison, the child is overwrought and very upset. The book implies that the child's ailment seems to come directly from her mother's anguish. See what it says. The child who, drawing its sustenance from the maternal bosom, seemed to have drunk in with it all the turmoil, the anguish, and despair which pervaded the mother's system. It now writhed in convulsions of pain, and was a forcible type in its little frame of the moral agony which Hester Prynne had borne throughout the day. Okay, so the child is very sickly and upset in the prison after they return from the scaffold. But notice how very early on it's established that this child seems to intuit everything about her parents, everything about her mother, and reflect that back. That idea has just been introduced, but it's going to continue throughout the book. When we finally actually get to see the child develop, we're all the way in chapter 6. In fact, all of chapter 6 is dedicated to the development of Pearl over the first 4 years of her life. And she's described as being very beautiful, but very complex. Pearl's aspect was imbued with a spell of infinite variety. In this one child, there were many children, comprehending the full scope between the wildflower prettiness of a peasant baby and the pomp in little of an infant princess. Throughout all, however, there was a trait of passion, a certain depth of hue, which she never lost, and if in any of her changes she had grown fainter or paler, she would have ceased to be herself. It would have been no longer little Pearl. And it goes on to describe her character. Her nature appeared to possess depth, too, as well as variety, but, or else Hester's fears deceived her, it lacked reference and adaptation to the world into which she was born. The child could not be made amenable to rules. In giving her existence, a great law had been broken, and the result was a being whose elements were perhaps beautiful and brilliant, but all in disorder, or with an order peculiar to themselves, amidst which the point of variety and arrangement was difficult or impossible to be discovered. There's a complexity about Pearl that is uncontainable. One of the reasons why, as we're reading through this book, we find Pearl to be such an odd character and such a very strange little girl is the fact that she doesn't seem to relate very clearly to the world around her. The book continues to call her sprite-like and fairy-like, and the townspeople even begin to get the feeling that she might be of demonic origin. After all, she just doesn't listen, and she's so weird and flighty. But the book continues to imply that her disconnection from the world around her and from life around her comes from being set apart at her birth. She's never had the opportunity to connect with the world around her. She certainly isn't accepted by the rest of society, and therefore, she is not really that human. Further on in the book, in chapter 16, it repeats this same idea in a slightly more complex way. As Pearl and her mother look at a little brook that seems to be singing sadly through the forest, it discusses how Pearl doesn't seem to relate to the brook because she doesn't feel sorrow. There was no other attribute that so much impressed her with a sense of new and untransmitted vigor in Pearl's nature as this never-failing vivacity of spirits. She had not the disease of sadness which almost all children in these latter days inherit, with the scrofula from the troubles of their ancestors. Perhaps this too was a disease, but the reflex of the wild energy with which Hester had fought against her sorrows before Pearl's birth. It was certainly a doubtful charm, imparting a hard, metallic luster to the child's character. She wanted what some people want throughout life, a grief that should deeply touch her, and thus humanize and make her capable of sympathy. But there was time enough yet for little Pearl. Will she ever become human? Well, first she's going to have to find a true human grief to connect back to humanity. Because Pearl is clearly the product of her parents' sin, she becomes a symbol for that sin, and even more so as the book drives her to be depicted as the Scarlet Letter itself. Pearl is already associated with sin by being the product of her parents' sin, but it seems as though Hawthorne goes out of his way to draw the connection between the Scarlet Letter, which Hester is wearing as a symbol for sin, and Pearl. Hester even draws this connection. Notice the way that Hester dresses Pearl when they're on their way to the governor's house in chapter 7. But it was a remarkable attribute of this garb, and indeed of the child's whole appearance, that it irresistibly and inevitably reminded the beholder of the token which Hester Prynne was doomed to wear upon her bosom. It was the Scarlet Letter in another form, the Scarlet Letter endowed with life. The mother herself, as if the red ignominy were so deeply scorched into her brain that all her conceptions assumed its form, had carefully wrought out the similitude, lavishing many hours of morbid ingenuity to create an analogy between the object of her affection and the emblem of her guilt and torture. But in truth, Pearl was the one as well as the other, and only in consequence of that identity had Hester contrived so perfectly to represent the Scarlet Letter in her appearance. So her little red dress reflects this fact that she is a symbol for the Scarlet Letter. So her little red dress represents the fact that she is, in some ways, the Scarlet Letter itself. She is the symbol for her parents' sin. This is further amplified by the fact that Pearl, from the very beginning of consciousness, becomes obsessed with the Scarlet Letter. She's constantly pointing it out on her mother's chest. She's constantly poking at it. She's constantly throwing things at it. She really, really is absolutely obsessed with this letter because it is who she is. It's part of her. One peculiarity of the child's deportment remains yet to be told. The very first thing which she had noticed in her life was what? Not the mother's smile, responding to it as other babies do by the faint embryo smile of the little mouth, remembered so doubtfully afterwards and with such fond discussion whether it were indeed a smile. By no means. But that first object of which Pearl seemed to become aware was, shall we say it? The Scarlet Letter on Hester's bosom. One day, as her mother stooped over the cradle, the infant's eyes had been caught by the glimmering of the gold embroidery about the letter, and putting up her little hand, she grasped at it, smiling, not doubtfully, but with a decided gleam that gave her face the look of a much older child. Pretty much every time we see Pearl, there's some connection to the Scarlet Letter. Either she's throwing flowers at her mother's Scarlet Letter, maybe pinning burrs onto it, or maybe designing a Scarlet Letter of her own out of green seaweed. The book won't stop making the connection between the two. But is that all she is? Is simply a symbol for sin? Well, no, she's much more complicated than that. In fact, the book also, at the same time that it's connecting her to sin and to the Scarlet Letter, is also connecting her to the idea of innocence. This is seen most clearly probably with the sunshine. Notice the way Pearl demands that Hester give her all the sunshine on the side of the governor's hall in chapter 7. Hester replies, "No, my little Pearl," said her mother, "thou must gather thine own sunshine. I have none to give thee." This image is further explored in chapter 16 as they're walking through the woods. And as they're walking down the path, Pearl is able to dance in the sunshine, but every time Hester reaches it, it goes away. "Mother," said little Pearl, "the sunshine does not love you. It runs away and hides itself because it is afraid of something on your bosom. Now see, there it is, playing a good way off. Stand you here and let me run and catch it. I am but a child. It will not flee from me, for I wear nothing on my bosom yet." "Nor ever will, my child, I hope," said Hester. "And why not, mother?" asked Pearl, stopping short, just at the beginning of her race. "Will it not come of its own accord when I am a woman grown?" "Run away, child," answered her mother, "and catch the sunshine. It will soon be gone." Of course, we see the similar image with the sadness of the brook that Pearl can't understand. And even Pearl's name is this mirror image of two things. In chapter 6, her name is explained as an allusion to the biblical story of the pearl of great price, where a person finds a pearl and sells everything he has to buy that one pearl. Hester has given up everything, and she's gained this treasure in her daughter. Her daughter is a great treasure to her, but she's also the result of losing everything. Man had marked this woman's sin by a scarlet letter, which had such potent and disastrous efficacy that no human sympathy could reach her, save it were sinful like herself. God, as a direct consequence of the sin which man thus punished, had given her a lovely child, whose place was on that same dishonored bosom, to connect her parent forever with the race and descent of mortals, and to be finally a blessed soul in heaven. In some ways, Pearl symbolizes the goodness that Hester can still be, and the goodness that she still has to impart. This becomes the source of her entire argument, and in fact the argument of Dimmesdale when the town threatens to take away Pearl. Listen to what Dimmesdale says when pleading her case at the governor's hall. "There is truth in what she says. truth in what Hester says and in the feeling which inspires her. God gave her the child, and gave her too an instinctive knowledge of its nature and requirements, both seemingly so peculiar, which no other mortal being can possess. And moreover, is there not a quality of awful sacredness in the relation between this mother and this child? For if we deem it otherwise, do we not thereby say that the Heavenly Father, the Creator of all flesh, hath lightly recognized a deed of sin and made no account of the distinction between unhallowed lust and holy love? This child of its father's guilt and its mother's shame hath come from the hand of God to work in many ways upon her heart, who pleads so earnestly and with such bitterness of spirit the right to keep her. It was meant for a blessing, for the one blessing of her life. It was meant, doubtless, the mother herself hath told us, for a retribution too, a torture, to be felt at many of unthoughtful moment. A pang, a sting, an ever-recurring agony in the midst of a troubled joy. Has she not expressed this thought in the garb of the poor child, so forcibly reminding us of that red symbol which sears her bosom? She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the existence of that child. And may she feel, too, what methinks is very truth, that this boon was meant, above all things else, to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve her from blacker depths of sin, into which Satan might else have sought to plunge her. Therefore, it is good for this poor sinful woman that she hath an infant immortality, a being capable of eternal joy or sorrow, confided to her care, to be trained up by her to righteousness, to remind her at every moment of her fall, and yet to teach her, as it were by the Creator's sacred pledge, that if she bring the child to heaven, the child will also bring its parent thither. Herein is the sinful mother happier than the sinful father. For poor Hester Prynne's sake, then, and no less for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence has seen fit to place them. That complex role of Pearl to be both a punishment to her mother and ultimately help her towards salvation, help remind her of the good and be a blessing. There's a particularly significant moment in chapter 15 which seems to sort of hit this point climactically. Pearl looks to her mother and asks for an explanation of the Scarlet Letter, and Hester doesn't give it to her. It's the first time she's really lied about it, and so it becomes sort of a turning point for her, and an opening for something particularly bad to happen at the end of the book. But in that moment, it explores the potential of Pearl to be something more than a punishment. Pearl's inevitable tendency to hover about the enigma of the Scarlet Letter seemed an innate quality of her being. From the earliest epoch of her conscious life, she had entered upon this as her appointed mission. Hester had often fancied that Providence had a design of justice and retribution in endowing the child with this marked propensity, but never, until now, had she bethought herself to ask whether, linked with that design, there might not likewise be a purpose of mercy and beneficence. If little Pearl were entertained with faith and trust as a spirit messenger no less than an earthly child, might it not be her errand to soothe away the sorrow that lay cold in her mother's heart and convert it into a tomb, and to help her to overcome the passion once so wild and even yet neither dead nor asleep, but only imprisoned within the same tomb-like heart? Is it possible that Pearl is here to bear part of the weight of her mother's past and to help her mother to overcome it? In any case, we don't realize that in this moment because Hester refuses to confide in Pearl and ultimately leads to further problems. Not only is Pearl clearly connected to the Scarlet Letter and to the idea of innocence at the same time, but she also has another characteristic that makes her kind of uncanny, and that is her intense intelligence and intuition. She is extremely creative and intelligent as a child, coming up with all kinds of creative games and ways of entertaining herself. She has no relationship with any of the other children or any of the other townspeople, and so her experience is entirely in the world of her and her mother. And so she makes up imaginary friends, but they aren't exactly friends. At home, within and around her mother's cottage, Pearl wanted not a wide and various circle of acquaintance. The spell of life went forth from her ever-creative spirit and communicated itself to 1,000 objects, as a torch kindles a flame wherever it may be applied. The unlikeliest materials, a stick, a bunch of rags, a flower, were the puppets of Pearl's witchcraft, and without undergoing any outward change, became spiritually adapted to whatever drama occupied the stage of her inner world. Her one baby voice served a multitude of imaginary personages, old and young, to talk withal. The pine trees, aged, black, and solemn, and flinging groans and other melancholy utterances on the breeze, needed little transformation to figure as Puritan elders. The ugliest weeds of the garden were their children, whom Pearl smote down and uprooted most unmercifully. It was wonderful, the vast variety of forms to which she threw her intellect, with no continuity indeed, but darting up and dancing, always in a state of preternatural activity, soon sinking down as if exhausted by so rapid and feverish a tide of life, and succeeded by other shapes of a similar wild energy. It was like nothing so much as the phantasmagoric play of the northern lights. In the mere exercise of the fancy, however, and in the sportiveness of a growing mind, there might be little more than was observable in other children of bright faculties, except as Pearl, in the dearth of human playmates, was thrown more upon the visionary throng which she created. The singularity lay in the hostile feelings with which the child regarded all these offspring of her own heart and mind. She never created a friend, but seemed always to be sowing broadcast the dragon's teeth, whence sprung a harvest of armed enemies against whom she rushed to battle. It was inexpressibly sad. Then what depth of sorrow to a mother, who felt in her own heart the cause, to observe in one so young this constant recognition of an adverse world, and so fierce a training of the energies that were to make good her cause in the contest that must ensue. Her imagination is constantly a battle. She's constantly fighting against the world around her, because that's the way she perceives the world. Everyone is against her. But this creativity and intelligence comes to light even more in the way she seems to clearly recognize the significance of what she sees around her, particularly when it comes to her greatest area of expertise, the Scarlet Letter. Pearl, early on, asks complex questions about the Scarlet Letter and its origin. She asks her mother what it means and why her mother wears it. And then, by the middle of the book, Pearl seems to make a clear connection between the Scarlet Letter and the reason that Arthur Dimmesdale always has his hand over his heart. In chapter 15, when Pearl makes her own version of the Scarlet Letter out of weeds from the ocean side, her mother asks her if she knows why she wears the Scarlet Letter. "Dost thou know, child, wherefore thy mother wears this letter?" "Truly do I," answered Pearl, looking brightly into her mother's face. "It is for the same reason that the minister keeps his hand over his heart." "And what reason is that?" asked Hester, half smiling at the absurd incongruity of the child's observation, but on second thoughts turning pale. "What has the letter to do with any heart, save mine?" Pearl doesn't know any more than her intuition reads, and yet she sees a connection between Dimmesdale and Hester, a connection that no one else has been able to see. Also, when Dimmesdale is standing on the scaffold in the middle of the night to try to relieve some of his own guilt, and he sees Hester and Pearl passing by and asks them to come up with him, Pearl demands that Dimmesdale stand with them in the middle of the day. Her relationship with Dimmesdale as the man who is literally her father, but yet will not recognize her as his daughter, is complicated. There are moments in the book when she shows him great affection, but there are other moments when she denies him affection and even acts with animosity towards him. The difference is entirely in the way Dimmesdale is acting in that moment. We've already referenced the moment when Dimmesdale defends the two of them in the governor's hall, and he stands up for Hester and talks the governor into letting Hester keep Pearl. At that moment, look at the way Pearl responds to Dimmesdale. She's 4 years old. The young minister, on ceasing to speak, had withdrawn a few steps from the group, and stood with his face partially concealed in the heavy folds of the window curtain, while the shadow of his figure, which the sunlight cast upon the floor, was tremulous with the vehemence of his appeal. Pearl, that wild and flighty little elf, stole softly towards him, and taking his hand in the grasp of both her own, laid her cheek against it, a caress so tender, and withal so unobtrusive, that her mother, who was looking on, asked herself, "Is that my Pearl?" Yet she knew that there was love in the child's heart, although it most revealed itself in passion, and hardly twice in her lifetime had been softened by such gentleness as now. The minister, for, save the long-sought regards of women, nothing is sweeter than these marks of childish preference, accorded spontaneously by spiritual instinct, and therefore seemed to imply in us something truly worthy to be loved. The minister looked round, laid his hand on the child's head, hesitated an instant, and then kissed her brow. Little Pearl's unwonted mood of sentiment lasted no longer. She laughed and went capering down the hall so airily that old Mr. Wilson raised a question whether even her tiptoes touched the floor. She sees the sincerity with which he defends them, and she responds with affection and gentleness, even receiving a kiss from Dimmesdale. Notice in contrast chapter 19, when after Dimmesdale and Hester meet in the woods, discuss their difficulties, and finally decide to run away together, Hester throwing off her Scarlet Letter, Pearl comes back and sees them there at the brookside, and she's not too happy. After all, both Hester and Dimmesdale are running away from their problems and hiding from them. Worst of all, her mother is no longer wearing the Scarlet Letter. She basically has a fit when she points out the fact that her mother doesn't have the Scarlet Letter on and Hester still tries to ignore it and call her on. She now suddenly burst into a fit of passion, gesticulating violently and throwing her small figure into the most extravagant contortions. She accompanied this wild outbreak with piercing shrieks, which the woods reverberated with on all sides, so that alone as she was in her childish and unreasonable wrath, it seemed as if a hidden multitude were lending her with sympathy and encouragement. Seen in the brook once more was the shadowy wrath of Pearl's image, crowned and girdled with flowers, but stamping its foot, wildly gesticulating, and, in the midst of it all, still pointing its small forefinger at Hester's bosom. So Hester has to repin the Scarlet Letter to her dress before Pearl will cross the brook and come back to them. It's as if Pearl is completely cut off from the two of them by this brook and living in another world, and she cannot come to Hester until Hester again recognizes the Scarlet Letter and in so doing recognizes her child. And when Hester tries to talk Pearl into being kind to Dimmesdale, after all, they're going to be a family now, right? Pearl asks some really awkward questions. Doth he love us? Will he go back with us, hand in hand, we three together, into the town? Is he going to recognize us in the town? And Hester says, no, but we will be able to be together eventually. And Pearl also asks, and will he always keep his hand over his heart? Pearl is fixated on Dimmesdale's hypocrisy and on his insincerity in this moment. And when finally Hester gets Pearl up to Dimmesdale and he kisses her forehead, unlike the first time we saw, Pearl runs over to the brook and washes it off immediately. She will not be sullied by this man's touch. Notice the difference in her response both these times. So Pearl, this double symbol, this complex young character who doesn't even seem to be human, she seems to be the embodiment of the Scarlet Letter. She sees through all the hypocrisy around her. She sees with a kind of intuition that allows her to understand her mother and her father's problems, even though they won't recognize them themselves. Will she ever be resolved? Will she ever be human? These complex questions are finally resolved in the end as Dimmesdale mounts the scaffold in front of everyone. After giving his greatest sermon ever, and just before he's supposed to escape with Hester and Pearl, he looks as though he is getting weaker and breaking down, and all of a sudden, instead of continuing on, he turns toward the scaffold and rises up onto the scaffold, and then invites Hester and Pearl up with him. And in that moment, he does what he needed to do all the way back to the beginning. He confesses. He stands with Hester, as he should have done at the very first chapter. And as Pearl had asked him to do when they stood on the scaffold in the middle of the night. And as Pearl had asked him to do when they were in the woods. Finally, he honors Pearl's request and recognizes her as his daughter. After he confesses and collapses on the scaffold, he turns to Pearl. He withdrew his eyes from the old man and fixed them on the woman and the child. "My little Pearl," said he feebly. And there was a sweet and gentle smile over his face, as of a spirit sinking into deep repose. Nay, now that the burden was removed, it seemed almost as if he would be sportive with the child. "Dear little Pearl, wilt thou kiss me now? Thou wouldst not yonder in the forest, but now thou wilt?" Pearl kissed his lips. A spell was broken. The great scene of grief in which the wild infant bore a part had developed all her sympathies. And as her tears fell upon her father's cheek, they were the pledge that she would grow up amid human joy and sorrow, nor forever do battle with the world, but be a woman in it. Toward her mother, too, Pearl's errand as a messenger of anguish was all fulfilled. Notice the way all the problems of Pearl are resolved in this one moment. After being recognized as Dimmesdale's child, she's able to grieve his death and therefore become human. She's no longer detached from the world. She's able to stop fighting with the rest of the world and become a woman in it. She no longer has to serve as this point of conscience for her mother and father. Now she can actually grow up and be a person herself. And she does, as we see in the final chapter, the conclusion chapter. Pearl inherits property from Chillingworth, and it says, "So Pearl, the elf child, the demon offspring, as some people up to that epoch persisted in considering her, became the richest heiress of her day in the New World. Not improbably, this circumstance wrought a very material change in the public estimation, and had the mother and child remained there, little Pearl, at a marriageable period of life, might have mingled her wild blood with the lineage of the devoutest Puritan among them all. But in no long time after the physician's death, the wearer of the Scarlet Letter disappeared, and Pearl along with her. So Pearl, the wild child, the child of sin, becomes something good, and is ultimately redeemed in the same redemption that rescues her father and mother. As usual, Hawthorne makes his characters much more rich and multi-layered than they at first appear. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more character analyses, you can click on one of the links over here, or you can click on down here to subscribe, and and I will see you next time.